It was a license to kill. He was one of America's most notorious mob bosses. He was violent, he was feared by many, but he accomplished the almost unimaginable. He got government agents to give him the ability to kill whomever he wanted. Welcome to Crime Waves. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Crime Waves. I'm Declan Hill, an associate professor of investigations at the University of New Haven. And each week, myself and my students, and today it's Brigitte Hairston and Alexia Miller, we bring you an interview with one of the world's best criminal investigators. And this week, it is the incredible, mind-blowing story of Whitey Bulger and his Winter Hill gang in Boston, and how they basically ran the organized crime squad of the FBI and elements of the Boston police force for over a decade. The man telling us this story is the award-winning author and professor of journalism at Boston University, Dick Lehr. Dick is a former member of the Spotlight team of the Boston Globe and a Pulitzer Prize finalist in investigative reporting. He's also the author of 7 award-winning books, and he spent over 20 years exposing this story of extraordinary corruption with his co-author, Gerard O'Neil. And their 2 books, Whitey, The Life of America's Most Notorious Mob Boss, and Black Mass, Whitey Bulger, the FBI, and A Devil's Deal, are brilliant. And they led to a film adaptation starring Johnny Depp and Benedict Cumberbatch. Now, in this podcast, we touch on that film. We also touch on my professional passion, match fixing and illegal sports gambling. But we really focus on that license to kill and how Whitey Bulger, a mobster, was able to get that from corrupt FBI agents. So Dick Lehr joins us on Crime Waves. Dick, it's a great honor to have you on Crime Waves podcast. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
You're welcome. It's good to be with you.
Brother, let's just get started right away. It's September 17th. It's 1981. Debbie Davis is in a car with a hitman for the Winter Hill gang in South Boston. What happens? Tell us that story.
Yeah, Debbie Davis, who is a stunningly beautiful young woman, is with Stevie Fleming. And they've been dating on and off for years. Stevie's jealous about losing her to another man. And Stevie is partners with, the legendary Boston gangster Whitey Bulger. Debbie Davis, from Whitey's perspective, has become a problem.
How so? What's she doing?
Well, Whitey has learned that Stevie has maybe told her too much about some of their underworld activities, their businesses and whatnot. So she's become a liability. And Whitey's go-to solution to these types of problems is to get rid of them. And so he has set up this situation where Stevie Fleming in that car is driving Debbie Davis to a house in South Boston that Stevie has bought for his mother. And it's supposed to be this very casual encounter where, come on, Debbie, I just want to show you my mom's new house. And in one of the strangest twists, there are so many in this very insular Boston world, that house that Stevie has bought for his mother, he's really done that, is actually next door to a Whitey Bulger's brother's house. So it's incestuous in that way.
Right.
But they drive up to the house in South Boston, and unbeknownst to Deborah Davis, is waiting inside is not a realtor of any kind, but is Whitey Bulger. And after she steps inside with Stevie, again, just thinking she's checking out a house, she meets the end of her life. Whitey and Stevie kill her. Problem solved. Her body is buried in a basement of another South Boston home where other bodies have been buried and eventually are buried. And it's part of Whitey's world.
And what I found so sickening about this brilliantly written story that begins your book, your along with Gerard O'Neil, was fantastic. Anyone listening and watching this, you've got to get this book. It is riveting, absolutely riveting, from page one. But is your description of this scumbag, and I hope that's not an insult to any scumbags listening, is Steve Flemmi, who brings his girlfriend over, presumably, sweetie, darling, come on in, check this house out for my mother, and then they kill this poor kid, this woman, and he pulls her teeth out with pliers. What's that all about?
Well, that's in the event that that she hopefully could never be identified if her corpse is eventually, discovered and whatnot. Um, it's part of the Whitey Bulger plan to, leaving no stone unturned or no tooth unpulled, to leave any trail that could
Yeah.
lead to him.
And I think it really speaks to the theme that these aren't glamorous guys. One of the things that really irritates me, I'm sure it irritates you as well, is that organized crime figures are often portrayed in this sexy fashion, the nice suits and stuff. But here is a man who is bringing his girlfriend in with, I presume endearments, and a few minutes later is literally pulling the teeth out of this dead woman's body with
Right.
pliers.
Yeah, no, and it's not an isolated incident. The utter depravity that is part of these guys' life and practices as gangsters and killers.
Tell
Um,
us about that. Tell us about that empire that they built in South Boston.
yeah, well, I mean, Whitey was, he rose through the ranks rather quickly and fearlessly, and was feared throughout the city as a young man, and all through his life. He was feared by the Italian mafia, um, which in Boston was the most powerful organization. Whitey was in many ways a cult of personality. I mean, he had an outfit and an organization. I would liken it to a closely held corporation, though. There was just an inner circle. And then there was everybody else out there who, either obeyed what he said or lived in fear of him. And I
And
mean, he
Dick,
lived
how is
off
he?
his
Sorry, I've maybe interrupted you, but I was going to say, how do these guys make their money? Is it all drugs, or what are they doing?
Well, they moved into drugs during the high flying 80s. But in the beginning, it was the classic, gangster portfolio, loan sharking and extortion, bookmaking, and requiring businesses to pay them fees for protection or rent or the right to do business in a particular area.
And
Uh,
some of that business included burglary, it included all those other things. Like all the crime guys were having to pay a tax to Whitey Bulger's gang.
yeah, and that's where he kind of evolved in a kind of smart executive way in terms of the criminal mind. Is well, he was always capable and did what in throughout a hands-on executive in terms of being able to threaten or kill somebody. Um, he evolved where just by virtue of his fear and his power of not getting his hands dirty in the day to day, but just making sure everyone paid him. And if you didn't pay him, your life's at risk.
Um, my passion, at least my professional passion, is sports gambling and illegal bookies. Tell us a little bit, because a number of people who follow this podcast really are into this as well. Tell us a little bit about that empire of illegal sports gambling in Boston at that time.
Yeah, it was a racket that obviously Whitey was involved in, but also the mafia in a big way.
Yes.
And this obviously predates, legalized betting and all that. And there were just, bookies all over town in stores and whatnot, and who took and placed bets. And it worked its way into whether it was the Angiulo crime family in the North End as the mafia, or into Whitey's world, where they were getting a piece of the action and had to, juggle the payoffs and all that kind of thing. Um, and so there was the gambling operation itself, which was, an ongoing and continuous business enterprise, criminal business.
Yes.
But then they also found other creative ways tip the scales and to of in certain sporting events where they
I mean,
could
they were fixing.
fixing and maximize their own positions and profits. And
Now we're talking about my field. Tell us one
yeah,
of those cases of match fixing, please.
yeah, in the mid to late 70s, Whitey, who at that point was part of what was known as the Winter Hill Gang, named after a neighborhood in Somerville, Mass,
Yes.
just outside of Boston, which is where their headquarters was. They teamed up with a horse race fixer by the name of Anthony Fat Tony Chula. Okay. Um, and throughout the mid to late 70s, it was a hugely successful operation where Tony was sort of the guy in the ground who had access into with the jockeys, the horse jockeys, in the pre-race. And with the backing of the Winter Hill Gang, with the backing of Whitey Bulger and his cohorts, would pay off jockeys to, to have the outcome of the race be preordained. And those who didn't want to go along, again, faced the wrath of the gang. And so they made an enormous amount of money off of that at horse race tracks up and down the East Coast. I mean, which I think obviously illustrates that we're not talking, when we're talking about the Bulger gang, of some kind of local neighborhood street corner outfit that maybe controlled a few square blocks of a city. No, I mean, they had big, and this is the late 70s. I mean, they had outreach up and down, horse race track up and down the East Coast.
They also moved into that Mexican squash-like game, Highlight. There was a World Highlight based out of Miami, Florida, and they were extorting and racketeering there. Tell me a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, and highlight was a sport with the highlight frontons. There's one in Connecticut and Florida. That again, it was in the 80s when it became a popular sporting venue and betting venue and whatnot. And Whitey exploited an entree into a company that was known as World Highlight, that owned a couple of frontons, especially the one in Florida, because there was a Boston businessman by the name of John Callahan, who was in business and finance and had been was an executive and president and part owner of World Highlight, who fashioned himself as kind of a wannabe gangster who liked to pal around. He hung around at a place called Chandler's Inn in Boston, which was a wise guy hangout.
Right.
And there he became friendly with Johnny Materano, who was a hitman for the Bulger gang. He became friendly with Whitey Bulger. And they concocted this scheme, and it involved money laundering and skimming and whatnot, where the highlight frontons, which were enormously profitable, that they would begin skimming money on a regular basis. And Callahan was their fixer in that, the inside guy, who managed the books and juggled the accounts that way to profit the Bulger gang. And in return, kind of the world went out, because there's a lot of organized crime, criminal infiltration into sports and sports betting.
Yep.
And the payoff for Callahan and World Highlight was, the word would go out is that don't mess with this company, because the Bulger gang, it's there.
It's behind them.
It's
Okay,
behind them.
Dick, we've got a case of scumbags, real scumbags, running a massive criminal empire based in South Boston, but has tentacles all across the city and up and down the eastern seaboard. Then the FBI gets involved, a guy named John Connolly, and the story now gets super weird, really weird. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, because simultaneously to the events that we're talking about, in the late 70s and the early 80s, one of the things that Whitey Bulger had going for him, that made him unique, and why we call him America's most notorious mob boss, is because he had an asset. He had achieved something that I don't think any crime boss in American history has ever achieved. No matter who it might be, Dillinger or Capone or any of the names that just pop off your tongue. I mean, Whitey Bulger had the FBI at his back, namely through FBI agent John Connolly. starting in mid 1975, they cut this unholy alliance.
And how did this unholy alliance, I mean, what were the details of the unholy alliance? What was going on?
Okay, well, again, a lot of this has to do with the history of American crime, the history of the FBI, and this again, black mass falls right smack in sort of the context of that larger historical arc. In the 60s, until the early 60s, Hoover's FBI, which had made its name off of solving bank robberies, in the 20s, the gangsters of that era, was in denial and denied that there existed an organized crime Italian mafia, the mafia, for the longest time, until the early 1960s, when it was no longer undeniable. And that's when Attorney General Robert Kennedy made going after the mafia the FBI, the government's number one priority. All right. The FBI, though, had to play catch up in a big way. They were way behind
Right.
on this front. And so what you saw throughout the 1980s, and what we've learned through the Boston corruption and the Boston experience, is that they were creating organized crime units in FBI offices around the country. And in Boston, a couple of key agents, the original members of the organized crime unit in Boston, two agents by the name of Paul Rico and Dennis Condon. It's amazing that they even had badges. I mean, they were lawless, and their idea of trying to play catch up was to install illegal bugs in the mafia headquarters to gather the intel to help them catch up in the situation. Paul Rico especially forged alliances with criminal informants in which he protected them from any kind of police involvement.
But John Connolly went way further than Rico in the 1960s. I mean, he essentially became a member of the Winter Hill Gang.
Exactly. And he becomes, and I'm just trying to set the stage because Rico and Condon set the stage, set the tone for a culture of lawlessness inside the FBI.
Yes.
Connolly actually worked with them. He learned in a way from they were his teachers, his mentors of sorts. So when he came back, John Connolly, who was a native of South Boston, his family actually lived in the same housing project as Whitey Bulger's family. They had this long family history, personal history. John Connolly grows up, goes to college, becomes an FBI agent, is assigned elsewhere, comes back to Boston in the early 1970s when all of this is happening.
Yes.
Get the mafia, get the Italian mafia. If you want to be, and John Connolly's an incredibly ambitious agent, if you want to be a star FBI agent, you're a handler of underworld informants who are fighting the mob. All this came together as a constellation of things that came together for John Connolly to approach Whitey Bulger in 1975 to team up. Okay, the mafia is your enemy, it's our enemy. You help me, I'll help you. In the beginning, I don't think John Connolly imagined how deep and dark and dirty it would go. He was looking to, become a star and to go after the North End Italian mob. And Whitey was not quite yet, the boss that he soon became. He was a high-ranking member of his gang. So to have him and his partner Flemmy to become informants was a huge cachet. So they kind of cut that deal in 1975, but very quickly it went bad because Whitey.
How did it go bad?
Because Whitey's, he's a brilliant, a crime boss, a brilliant criminal mind, and he turned. It's more, ideally it's the agent who turns the informant to become a government source. Whitey Bulger very quickly turned Connolly into becoming his informant about government activities against him and his gang. And what flows from that 1975 unholy alliance is it develops into the worst informant scandal in FBI history, where Whitey Bulger could count on Connolly and other agents in that organized crime unit.
Yes.
They essentially became members of his gang, not only alerting him state police, other federal agencies like the DEA, anyone who was going after Whitey. Conley blew was a whistleblower of sorts for Whitey.
Hang on. You mean John Conley and the other corrupted FBI agents would tell Bulger about other secret informants?
Yes. Tell them about perhaps other investigations, or that there's actually a wire being put on you, or, a place where you go or your car. So to be mindful of that, but also leak the identities of other people, others in the underworld who have begun cooperating.
He leaked the identities of other informants. What happened to those poor people?
They ended up dead. Again, the Whitey solution. It's like what we started off with Deborah Davis. A potential problem is to be eliminated, which is why John Conley ended up in prison. In connection, again, looping back to that World Highlight case.
Yes. And
John Callahan. That, after being so enormously profitable for a while, got complicated for Whitey and the gang, where it led to the gang having to murder the new owner of World Highlight, a man by the name of Roger Wheeler, a Tulsa, Oklahoma businessman and millionaire, because he had taken over the company, even though Callahan was still involved, their inside guy. And they became very worried about, the cash cow.
Just a sec, Dick, before we go back to Highlight, let's make sure that we get our viewers and listeners to grasp this. Conley and other organized crime FBI members, agents, get the names of secret informants, other secret informants, and they tell Whitey Bulger who these guys are, and these guys end up dead.
Yes, I know. It gives you a big pause, right? You have to go back and really?
Yeah. Well, because this is blood, this is death, this is people's murder that they're. I mean, this is beyond, hey, I made an administrative mistake and I didn't pay, blah, blah, blah. This is like people dead. How many informants, how many people was that flow of information from corrupted FBI agents to Whitey Bulger? How many killings were there?
Well, according to, there are at least, 3, 4, maybe. I don't really remember at the top of my head. And this, according to Flemmy, who ultimately, and Johnny Materano, members of the game who have ultimately testified at numerous hearings and trials, and Kevin Weeks, who was an enforcer.
Yes.
And they all turned against Whitey, in the 21st century. They graphically described the depths of this unholy alliance, and the benefits for the gang, which involved just what you summarized.
And in terms of the whole unholy alliance, and I love that term, how many members of Boston law enforcement, FBI, Boston police, state police, whatever, how many people are taking gifts, bribes, money from Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill gang during the late 70s and throughout the 1980s?
Well, if according to Flemmy and Weeks and their testimony, we're talking about dozens, and they had what they called an X fund, or an expense fund, that where they regularly doled out payoffs. And there's different degrees of the compromise.
Yes.
The most widespread were these just bribes and payoffs to Boston police and other police agencies, and whatnot. And in return, some basic information, street information, or whatever, just some form of protection, right?
Well, some information about confidential agents that the gang went out and killed.
Yeah, no, but that's what I mean, different degrees. And then
yes,
there was a radioactive core of sorts.
Yes.
And that just involved the FBI, where you had John Conley. They succeeded in compromising and corrupting John Conley's supervisor of the organized crime unit, an agent by the name of John Morris. And that was brilliant because, again, on paper, administratively, a supervisor is a check and balance. If you have an informant handler who's, the term is going native, is getting too involved with the criminal informant, supervision is supposed to like pull that back in. That's a guardrail of sorts.
Yes. Yes.
So it's brilliant to take him out in terms of corrupting him. They did that with John Morris. Those were the two most intimately involved, I'll say, members of the Bulger gang.
And this went on for how many years?
We're talking, it began in 75. It blew up 15 or 16 years later.
Wow. So, I mean, this is embedded culture at times of corruption inside the FBI organized crime
Yes.
group. And there are various other Boston law enforcement agents who are accepting Christmas gifts and bribes from these guys.
Yes.
So, in doing the research, Dick, before I met a famous author like yourself, I spoke to a source was an undercover agent in during the biker wars in Quebec, which, as you know, had hundreds of deaths. And he
Mhm.
said, yeah, you got to do selective strategy. You got to attack the rock machine first, and then you go after the Hells Angels because you don't have unlimited resources at that time. Was there any justification for this culture of corruption in terms of Boston at that time?
There's none whatsoever. I mean,
Why not?
in terms of the corruption, because they're the good guys, the cops. You can't be doing that. I mean, in theory, the idea of enlisting Whitey Bulger as an informant back in the mid 1970s, that's a good move. But it's not. The way the informant system is, it's not a license to kill, which is what the FBI ultimately gave Bulger. Once it was corrupted, the agents were so compromised. They had been bribed. They took money. They took gifts. They leaked informant information. There was blood on their hands. It is the massive example of what not to do and how it's not supposed to be managed. It was a selective strategy because the government, the highest levels of government, made it clear with the Italian mafia was the highest priority. That
Yes.
became a cover of sorts for them to continue and maintain the corruption with Whitey Bulger. I had an amazing interview over the years, and he's in our books, with a deputy super agent in charge of the Boston office, who in the 80s was supervising the organized crime squad, and he got wind of the corruption, and he tried to blow the whistle on it. The corruption involving John Morris and John Conley.
Yes. Yes.
And it didn't go. Because I think everyone had so bought into the payoff, the return. They didn't want to know. They didn't want to. It was like, see no evil, hear no evil. Let's just get the results, which is bringing down the Angulo crime family, if that's the benefit. He gave me like a lesson, like informant 101 lesson when he finally spoke to me about. And his loyalties was with the FBI, because he would just say Bulger's ruining the FBI. And the problem is, we're talking now the mid 80s now.
Right.
He said, he was explaining to me that Whitey Bulger is now the most powerful gangster in Boston. You go after a guy like that, you don't have him as your informant. He's the top guy. It's what it's all about. And he then described the problem is people like, especially John Conley, have gone native, is what he's called it.
Yeah, they effectively became untouchables, those guys.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing, again, I'm holding up your book because I want people who are watching this to really get hold of Dick's book. It is brilliant. He writes it with his colleague Gerard O'Neil. They worked on this for decades. A number of other books as well, best-selling books, but this is stunning expose of it. You also talk about the political corruption, because all this time that's going on here, Bulger has a brother who's in the political establishment. Tell us a little bit about him, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes this Boston story,
unbelievable to anyone non-Bostonian.
Yeah, because as Whitey Bulger rose to the highest levels of the underworld and became the most powerful gangster in Boston, his younger brother Bill had a similar rise to power in public office and politics. So they were both at the top of their game at the same time in the mid 80s. Bill Bulger was the president of the state Senate, arguably the most powerful position in Massachusetts. And even if, the atmospherics of it all were just paralyzing for those in politics and public life, and also those um, in law enforcement. In law enforcement, there was this atmospheric concern and culture that if you kind of went after Whitey, you might see your budget cut um, by the state legislature,
Right.
backroom hands of Bill Bulger. Whether real or not, it didn't matter. That was
It had that impression.
the impression.
Again, just to jump in, just so I'm not seen as picking on Boston, I'm going to get, shouted at by Massachusetts people. Up in Canada, the Liberal Party in Quebec has similar issues with really high-ranking Sicilian mafia guys and Liberal Party senators back in this late 80s, excuse me, late 90s, early 2000s, where you're like, no, hang on a second. They both got the same last name. They're both from the same village in Sicily. What's going on here? And it's that sense of untouchability that political connections bring to mobsters.
Right, and that was a dominant force throughout the 80s and into the 90s in Boston.
So the mid 90s, it implodes.
Mhm.
Bulger goes on the run. This extraordinary, it almost becomes popular myth across America. Who's seen Whitey Bulger? Tell us about those 16 years where he's on the run.
Yeah, no, I mean, and again, he was alerted to the sealed indictment by none other than John Connolly.
Hold on just a second. I'm sorry, I missed that in your book. What, like, so he goes on the run because the FBI agent tells him that they've got something going?
And this is amazing about John Connolly's access and power, both staying power, because he'd actually retired from the FBI, become a corporate security chief, but he kept his lines open at the FBI. He was monitoring. There was a whole new team, a whole new generation of federal prosecutors who were determined to indict, because again, he's the biggest game in town.
Yes.
The mafia was in decline. And so Connolly kept his pulse on that investigation through his own sources. He learned that Bulger had been indicted. He tipped Whitey off in 1995 in January, and Whitey hit the road, not to be seen until 2011.
And there's a great line by one of your colleagues, one of the journalistic colleagues. He looks at the FBI, quote, progress report. The FBI brings out a report every year on trying to find Whitey Bulger. And he says, they weren't a progress report. They're a failure report.
Yeah, exactly.
You still haven't caught the guy.
Yeah.
So for 16 years, and there was one example where finally the Boston law enforcement wakes up and says, hang on, what has been going on? And they're prevented by this culture of corruption among the FBI to really prosecute John Connolly. Tell us a little bit about that, please, Dick.
Well, it was just this, this tangled up law enforcement with competing loyalties and competing agendas at war internally with itself. You had, again, leftovers from, it's almost like history, turning the page. You had leftovers from one generation determined to keep the lid on and protect, the people who may have gotten, or at least, minimize the damage. And then you had a new team that was determined to trying to get to the bottom of it. And part of this had to do with, how hard and how far to go after John Connolly and John Morris, and revealing their corruption. And then the FBI, ultimately their spin on everything became, and I've always had a problem with this, is their effort to spin it as two bad apples in the FBI scenario. That's the reason for this breakdown. Instead of the systemic corruption and the culture of corruption that had been established even before they got, Morris and Connolly got going. I mentioned the 60s, and
mentioned the Christmas gifts, the list of dozens of Boston law enforcement, both inside and outside the FBI taking cash. Yeah. I know you're jumping to another interview, but I just want to ask you, your book, yours and Gerard's book, is turned into Black Mass, a movie featuring Johnny Depp. An amazing performance by Johnny Depp, really something an Oscar-winning, should have been an Oscar-winning performance. What was it like to work in a Hollywood movie and play yourself? At one point you were acting as yourself, I believe.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are a lot of different feelings and in that experience. I mean, one was watching this work come to life in a new way, in a new medium, and also having to become comfortable with what movies do to true stories, because it's an adaptation. I mean,
Yes.
it's not true. The movie is an adaptation. It's a dramatization. There's plenty in the movie that is made up. And as a journalist and a nonfiction person, that gave me the willies in the beginning and stuff like that. Wait, they never said this, or
Yes.
this never happened. Wait, you've moved the chronology around here. And I had to get used to, well, if you're going to allow them to adapt your book, then you have to let go, in the sense that they only have 120 minutes to tell 25 years of mob history, or the story's history and whatnot, and accept and always speak of it as an adaptation or a dramatization, not the absolute truth. There's a famous story about another author who wrote a book, and then they made it into a movie, and the movie came out very differently from the book. And a friend of the author said, "Aren't you mad? Look what they've done to your book. Aren't you upset?" And the author said, "Look," he held up his book and said, "They haven't done anything to my book. My book is my book. They've made a movie." And so that helped me settle down a little bit.
Yes, because I have to say, my complaint about the film was that it made it seem like two bad apples.
Yeah.
And I understood why they needed to do it dramatically, but there wasn't that pushback against these guys. The FBI was embroiled with these guys, and the pushback was coming from outside the agency.
That was my chief concern about the film as well. My chief concern.
I know you got to go, but if you don't mind wrapping up what you've described as the biggest case of an enforcement scandal in U.S. law enforcement.
Yeah,
what's the takeaway?
Well, I think the takeaway is while informant information is a centerpiece of any law enforcement agency's mission and stuff. I mean, and especially at the FBI, they really rely on informants and the use of informants. I think a huge takeaway is how challenging and tricky and dangerous it is, and how quickly it can go bad. And no matter how good it looks on paper in terms of any kind of checks and balances to oversee it, it's all about the execution and the relationships and the personal relationships. And it went so off the rails here, and so it's just so high risk. And I just don't think, that's what I learned a lot about in the takeaway, and how enormously challenging it can be. And it's a horror show that this instance of corruption went on for so long. It wasn't a single case that was compromised and then it was over. It became a way of life here.
For me, the three-word takeaway that I would have from listening to you and reading your book and watching the movie, the adaptation of your book, is license to kill.
Yeah.
The corrupted FBI gave these guys the targets and then said, "Hey, not a problem if they kill these guys." Extraordinary.
That is the truth. That's the extreme. That's the worst case scenario of the informant work that's done. Is the agency provides the informant a license to kill, and that's what informant supervision, or whatever the framework might be, has to be guarded against in an extreme way.
Dick, thank you for your time this morning. It's mind-blowing. Thank you for this book and your other 6 books. It's an honor to speak with a man like yourself. Really, really appreciate you coming on Crime Waves this morning.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed being with you.
Hey, it's Declan. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Crime Waves called A License to Kill, about the mobster Whitey Bulger and his corruption of the FBI. Now, a quick note, Dick Lehr has a new book, White Hot Hate, a true story of domestic terrorism in America's heartland. It's coming out in a couple of weeks, and you'll find it on Amazon, or frankly, anywhere that you can buy a good book, like a small, independent bookstore. If you like this episode or the podcast, please follow us or subscribe on social media like YouTube or Apple Podcasts. It's hugely important. But thank you again for your company. and we'll see you next week for another episode of Crime Waves.